Hello and welcome to the UK column. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Isa Blumi. Isa is Professor of Asian and Middle East Studies at Stockholm University Institute of Turkish Studies in Sweden. Welcome to the program, Isa. Now, I want to talk today about Sudan, the situation in Sudan, which is about as grim as it gets. I think a pretty unpleasant war, a conflict going on there since April 2023. Well, as we'll discuss, no doubt it's something that's actually been going on for a lot longer than that, but the latest iteration, at least for a couple of years. Now, aside from, the occasional UK government press release, which never gets any coverage in the mainstream press, most people in the UK at least know almost nothing about this conflict. It's going on without any major media coverage in this country at all. So although we have talked about it several times in UK column news, I can't say that we are particularly familiar with the detail of it. So I suppose my first question is this a civil war? It's being described as a civil war, or is it another conflict which is being driven by external forces?
Yes, it's the latter. Much of Africa and neighboring countries like Yemen, especially, are the unfortunate target of rival, sometimes corporate, therefore private, but they form useful unions, alliances with actual states with still the ability to borrow lots of money and buy lots of weapons or make them themselves and deliver them to areas where natural resources of Africa are highly coveted strategic pressure points that will allow for access to other regions are targeted. So unfortunately, Sudan, just like many of its neighbors, especially to the south, with the Democratic Republic of Congo being perhaps the most notorious, with Rwanda being a close second. They are all been targeted since the end of the Cold War, at least, for plunder. And chaos is an actual wonderful context and condition to actually realize very profitable plunder of natural resources.
I mean, Sudan has been a country of interest to the British Empire for a very long time. And of course, Kitchener, Khartoum, this is all something which is part of British history. Is this just the latest iteration of that same colonial project?
Indeed. It was actually Muhammad Ali, the soldier of Ottoman association, who successfully expanded Egypt's influence deep into the tropical areas of East Africa, Central Africa, in the 1820s, 1830s already. And one of the primary reasons was to open up trade from Central Africa to the Mediterranean Red Sea, as well as, most importantly, secure access to gold. The Sudan in those days was, much like West Africa, considered to be the equivalent of California and other places where gold was highly, it was accessible, and considerable profits could be made from mining. Now, that's one way of understanding the development of Sudan's connection to Egypt and how the British would inherit that when they occupied Egypt in the 1880s. And unfortunately, the kind of calculations that come with thinking about these areas are primarily political, economic, as opposed to moral or interest in the quite very complex cultural checkerboard, if you will, of the peoples who live in these very difficult areas of Africa. Yes, the British still have an interest through their own kind of proxies, although there are multiple layers of separation now between those who are really responsible for all of this and the ones who are actually being blamed for it. So we can maybe get into that in more detail about who are actually the primary foreign actors at the moment. But let's not forget ever that whether it's the UAE or Turkey or other players out there, that they are still deeply connected to the North Atlantic empire that have emerged in the 19th century.
Yes. So, do you think this is this conflict sort of as a result of Chinese and Russian interest in this area? And on one side, and the other side, we've got British players like the Tony Blair Foundation Institute, whatever you want to call it these days, very, very interested in this, but also the European Union viewing North Africa, the Sahel region, right across the southern area of the Sahara, right across the Horn of Africa, as being its southern neighborhood and an area of its interest and influence.
My goodness, yeah. I mean, there's so many things that come into play here. You mentioned Russia, which, especially private military capacities, since the end of the Cold War, they were out and provided services for various dictatorships. I mean, Yugoslavian forces also had a certain expertise and delivered and offered in neighboring Zaire. In those days, it was called Zaire. Military forces that help shore up national armies. Sudan, if we can go back maybe to the end of the Cold War, where political Islam really starts to play an important sedative role in subduing potentially very dangerous regional actors who, like Muammar Gaddafi, for instance, who had long been in the neighboring Chad, which is an important part of this story, what's happening in Sudan, had been involved in influencing and expanding Libya's influence in this anti-colonial struggle that cut across much of Africa since obviously the beginning of the 20th century. And the use of political Islam with the man named Turabi, Hassan Turabi, who became notoriously connected to these Muslim Brotherhood outfits that started to spread and gain influence throughout the Middle East and the Arabic-speaking world, in sometimes obvious connections with what was happening in Turkey, the rise of Erdogan, first as a mayor of Istanbul, and then becomes this kind of shining star of political Islam and a kind of a alliance, if you will, a realignment of the Islamic world in relation to North Atlantic world. And Turabi became this kind of useful target for at least media-led campaigns against political Islam, where in fact there was actually deep partnerships. We know that the armed forces that were being used by and funded and trained by the CIA and MI6 around the world did find safe haven also in Sudan during the 1990s, even though periodically would be, again, a useful justification for the war on terrorism. We know that Khartoum was attacked by American forces at some point, and notoriously the hospital or factory building producing generic drugs was hit. But that initiated or signaled to us that Sudan's oil wealth, Sudan's potential for mining, but more importantly, again, its geographic location, the Red Sea, the Nile rivers that were going to converge in Khartoum and continue to be a big geostrategic issue. And there were already in the 90s recognition that with the end of the regime in Ethiopia, that Ethiopia and Eritrea, which divided Somalia, which would see a process of disintegration, that Sudan was more or less following the same track, where it became clear that, like Yemen, like Iraq, like Libya, breaking up these larger amalgamated territories into zones of conflict, of chaos, would make it easier for determining or dictating the way these regions would be integrated into the global economy moving forward. And unfortunately, Sudan would first be on the radar screen, if you will, through this very, I think, still capable Sudanese resistance to this process. Now, it would be undermined by political Islam, the relationship that political Islam had in the narrative of as far as the British and the Americans were concerned. So a lot of violent capacity was brought to Sudan that led to civil war or conflict between rival factions as opportunities that were opened up. South Sudan was encouraged to pursue a war of independence, which was ultimately secured with the incredible violence in the interim period leading to the crisis in Darfur in the early 2000s, where I think many of your listeners in the UK or elsewhere probably remember still. It was a legitimate humanitarian disaster, which pitted Muammar Gaddafi's forces who wanted to secure, protect their partners in Chad against these encroachments of now increasingly Gulf countries with their Muslim Brotherhood assets to take over the enterprise of steering the Muslim world into the direction of cohabitating comfortably with globalization, with neoliberalism. And again, a lot of principled peoples around the world, including Sudan, had a very articulate stand against that process. They were not happy seeing a potentially very rich independent country being parceled out, its assets being privatized as being demanded by international agencies and development groups tied to the United States, Britain, the UN, et cetera, the IMF. And so sadly, much what we see, the kind of playbook elsewhere in the world is playing itself out in Sudan. And the consequences are large parts of this vast country had been parceled off. Warlords were rewarded with diplomatic recognition. They found secondary support from countries that seemingly were at odds with each other. But if you actually go deeper into their connections in the global political economy, they actually share common patrons: Israel, the United States, Britain. So Turkey, Qatar, seemingly at odds and in rivals against the UAE, Saudi Arabia, who are playing the kind of leaders of these proxy wars in a place like Sudan, are actually in other ways very well connected to the same usual suspects, if you will. And unfortunately, when the Russians and the Chinese get involved, their weapons, their soldiers, their know-how, they are not very effectively able to demonstrate a separation from this process either. They are implicated in this violence, and it becomes in the media, it becomes in the scholarship, a classic example of Africans killing each other, right? So civil war, that's the narrative as it's been played out and elsewhere. But it is in fact an invasion of global capital using various means to disaggregate countries that could have very easily steered their way after the Cold War into being independent, wealthy, self-sustaining societies. And unfortunately for Sudan, it's like Ethiopia, like the Horn of Africa, like Yemen, very rich countries. A lot of its territory started to get privatized and sold off, especially to investment firms attached to sovereign wealth funds that were simply providing the kind of capital, if you will, for this process of globalization, of forcing Sudanese to surrender their sovereignty to global capital.
Yeah. You used the term political Islam there a number of times. Could you just say a little bit more about that? And are you talking about the influence of Muslim Brotherhood or Boko Haram in Chad and Niger and so on? Is this all part of that same process?
Yes. We lose, again, we get distracted by seeing jihadist Takfiri groups as somehow a threat to Western stability, where in fact they work in tandem with agencies that see them as auxiliaries for otherwise what would be necessarily overt invasions. So again, while there were NATO planes dropping bombs in Libya, it was actually these kinds of forces that were doing the heavy lifting of killing and taking over territories. And the same would be applied in northern Nigeria, in Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, even though now there's been a response to that, and there's been efforts by the peoples of the Sahel region to try to reorganize and defend themselves from these tools of Western imperialism. In Sudan, they have not been able to escape that. And so again, the personalities that sometimes are very articulate, like this Hassan Turabi, has long been marketed as someone who actually stood on principle against globalization, against Westernization, and is supposedly steering their societies towards traditional values, based on something called Sharia law. But they are simply just cookie cutter characters that have been created and are marketed as easy targets for justifying heavy investment in destroying these societies. You cannot distinguish them from the origins, which are, again, intermediaries like Saudi Arabia or Qatar. But if you just look deeper at how Saudi Arabia and Qatar are entirely serviceable to larger global capital interest, then it's hard to see what happened to Sudan in 1990s and 2000s as anything but a externally manufactured, very quickly, rapidly declining security situation for the peoples of Sudan. Again, people get a little confused in Sudan. They got confused. They became partisans in these so-called ideological battles. Sudanese are very well educated. They speak. They have Khartoum University. I actually visited in 1993 this country, and very, very impressive society who are well represented around the world. And they had their responses. They had something called neighborhood resistance committees by the thousands throughout Sudan, organizing, fermenting kind of civic resistance to this structural transformation of their country. But they were always pushed aside and brutalized by militant groups who were functionally armed by either security forces of Sudan or supported by intelligence agencies from abroad. And again, just simply in the kind of discourse about the Middle East, about the Islamic world in Sudan, this became easily just marketed as simple conflict between Islamicists and between ethnic groups, between Arabs and Africans, and it's just not that easy. And so political Islam became one of those animating forces that forced people to into certain corners, if you will, and became actually even more divided amongst themselves. While there was desperate efforts by various intellectuals, not Sudanese nationalists, who are saying, "Let's not fall into this trap." And again, you see this personality of people resisting globalization throughout the world, but they've been regularly supplanted and pushed aside by not only the violent militias and forces that actually have the arms, but by the way we talk about these conflicts. So it was not a civil war. It is not a civil war per se. At least its origins was not one conflict between Sudanese entirely, even though they're the ones who are dying for the last 30 years.
Yeah. If we look at a sort of standard narrative of what's going on there, the civil war is supposed to involve Sudanese armed forces on one side, and with the Rapid Support Forces, which is supposed to be a paramilitary force, and the Janjaweed coalition is mentioned as well. I mean, I have no real understanding of who is whom here and who's supported by which foreign influence. So could you just say a little bit about who the main players are in the conflict in Sudan and who is supporting them?
Right. So this process of seeing Sudan break apart and outsiders encouraging the separation of South Sudan, which supposedly culturally were either animists or Christian, and that led to, it was already in the Cold War. There was kind of factions being armed at that stage. Again, it's connected to what's happening in Rwanda and Uganda and DRC. But the struggle by the Sudanese government in Khartoum to try to preserve the borders of Sudan throughout the 2000s was in many ways steered by a coalition, including this Turabi figure that I mentioned before, Muslim Brotherhood, fiercely anti-communist. So if you put that into the context of the late Cold War, political Islam is a mobilizing force. It was also seen as one as to explaining why the central government in Sudan, in Khartoum, was so violent against southern Sudanese, and that's why southern Sudanese separation was necessary. And one of the ways that the Sudanese government, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, in their attempt to try to keep southern Sudan, where 80% of the oil of Sudan is based, and probably lots of its gold as well, that they would have to resort to mobilizing forces that were outside of the military itself in order to protect the formal government from accusations of war crimes or seeing maybe a kind of formal efforts to shut down their operations in what was clearly, in some circles in the West, trying to mobilize evangelical Christianity as a kind of cause célèbre that South Sudan needed separation. So what happened is that we started to see militias emerging, and the Janjaweeds were, by design, fanatical Islamic Takfiri types who were to pursue the ethnic purification and the removal of problematic non-Arab, non-Muslim populations along the borders of South Sudan and Chad. And so the Janjaweeds emerged in this context. And one of the key actors and partners of this process, we just saw, by the way, in The Hague, the charging of war crimes by one of the leaders of the Janjaweed. It was just yesterday, I believe, or 2 days ago. What was his name? I can't remember now his name, who was Abdul Rahman, who was just now charged for war crimes. But his primary partner on the ground was this Muhammad Dagalo, or Hemeti, who had now inherited this old operations that Khartoum government and the official military had harvested to conduct military actions in very unprofessional ways, let's just say, just a very brutal regime of violence against targeted populations that led to what we can call a genocide in Darfur in the early 2000s. They were able to secure, however, that part of Sudan from being separated to create a separate ethnic state, as was on call often in Western circles at the time. But it also helped create kind of structural dynamic that allows this Hemeti to become now a kingmaker in larger Sudan. Omar Bashir, who was notorious and became the kind of, again, poster child for how the West will intervene and try to halt Islamic fundamentalism as it's manifested in the Khartoum government. Sudan will become part of the larger problem. There will be collective efforts in international community to isolate Omar Bashir's government. But again, they will be able to avoid and circumvent some of the restrictions on their military capacities by maintaining these militias that seem to operate independent of the state. And accordingly, there will be money funneled and supply chains will be opened up to provide this Hemeti with the capacity to be a major player in Sudanese politics, to the extent that it actually leads to along with his sometimes partner, Burhan, who is now currently the general leading the so-called Sudanese, official Sudanese army, and they recognized the Sudanese government. They worked together to assure that the popular revolution that was happening on the streets throughout Sudan, after a great deal of fatigue and a very well organized, as I mentioned, there were these neighborhood committees being established throughout Sudan, kind of doing what was happening elsewhere in the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011. So this was manifesting in 2018, 2019. And much like elsewhere, Muslim Brotherhood, Takfiri type groups, mobilizing if necessary, ethnic politics, language politics, suppress a popular uprising against Omar Bashir. He will be replaced by a now recognized coalition that would bring this Burhan and Hemeti together. And that's where we were at 2020, 2019, 2020. And over the next couple of years, these two groups start to separate. They start to take conflicting claims over who actually has authority, who has the right to claim to be representative of the official Sudanese government, and all the privileges that come with that. Negotiating for loans, getting access to the key infrastructure assets that still remained. There would still be the open question about the pipelines that would connect South Sudan's oil with the Red Sea and international markets. So that was all up for grabs. And that's when you start to see new opportunities for taking sides, supporting both now clearly delineated factions inside this coalition, which again functioned to suppress real popular revolution in Sudan, to actually see Sudanese taking control of their destiny again. Again, very articulate, we can even say with sometimes a Marxist critique of Sudan's relations with the larger world, informing how these popular committees were demanding for a representative government. But that was not going to be allowed by the international community. And so what it becomes is then who is going to represent the international community's interest in Sudan? And it's these two basically warlords and their loyal or relatively loyal armies around them. And that leads to what we call the RSF. This is the Hemeti, the old Janjaweed kind of militias that worked in partnership with Khartoum throughout the 2000s. It is now virtually taken over the Western Sudan, where all the gold mines are. It has received a great deal of support from, let's say, spin-offs of the Wagner Group that had established itself as a kind of protection agency for mining operations in Central African Republic and elsewhere throughout Africa. And more importantly, the main, let's say, market, if you will, for this blood gold that's being plundered from Western Sudan. And that's the gold market in Dubai. And it's become now a notorious connection between this RSF or Hemeti and the UAE is becoming kind of the useful target, if you will, for explaining how this war works, how this horrible situation in Sudan works, that it's the UAE's role in sustaining the RSF, while in the meantime, Turkey, Qatar, perhaps Israel, which, by the way, had signed an agreement first with Omar Bashir and then with this Burhan in 2020 to normalize relations akin to what happened with Bahrain and the UAE around the same time under the late first Trump administration. So that element comes into play here as well. But today we're supposedly seeing an enduring war that burst out in Khartoum itself in 2023 with the RSF, this Hemeti militia, for a while at least, occupying Khartoum, forcing the recognized government to move operations to Port Sudan. and continuing with this war of plunder in Western Sudan, with the so-called government of Sudan now in Port Sudan, the city of Port Sudan on the Red Sea. Um, uh, just in May, I think it was March, April, May, were able to resecure Khartoum of 2025. And the city is destroyed, and much of the possibility of, let's say, making Sudan, whatever remains of Sudan, a functional country is virtually impossible as long as this rivalry continues. And it continues to be fed with weapons coming from China, from the UAE. The Chinese drones are usually, and other kind of sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons are coming through the UAE, which are then shipped to Chad or to Central African Republic and then transported by land, even though there is de facto international communities oversight, condemning these operations, placing embargoes on the companies that are involved, often directly connected by family to Hemeti, based in the UAE or based in Uganda or Rwanda, which is also one of those destabilizing forces in Africa, which requires another episode, I think.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for your audience. It's very complicated. It sounds like I'm just running off in all kinds of directions, but it would not be fair to just say it's a simple proxy war. But that's how it's become, at least at this phase now, where it's impossible to talk about Sudan in many circles because of the conflicted interest of those who are supposedly intervening to try to stop this war. And if we actually, again, push ourselves to see who's actually at the very end responsible for all this, it's those who are claim to now having the exclusive right to determine how this war ends. And there's the very simple fact that they don't want to see this war end. There's just so much wealth being plundered from Sudan at the moment. Much like what we see elsewhere in Africa and parts of the Middle East. There's not going to be a resolution because the United States, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, Russia, China, they all have their very specific interests at play here that have nothing to do with strategically, defying, if you will, and challenging rivals. It's more seeing access to the assets that are being plundered and having maybe a greater, let's say, piece of this Sudanese pie that's rapidly being torn away and eaten up by global capitalism. So that's how. I don't know if that's a satisfactory way of explaining what's happening between the so-called Sudanese forces and the RSF, but just now in the last couple of weeks, it's gotten more worse, even more so because one, it's the rainy season. It's very hard to actually have ground battles in Sudan at the moment, at least in the western Darfur areas. There's the city of Al-Fasher, which is the main city of Darfur, which is under siege now for, I think, 500 plus days. 300, 400,000 people are stuck there, dying, starving. The 14 million Sudanese are now categorically under the radar of possible starvation, suffering from hunger. And now the drones warfare that is becoming more and more a quality of life in many parts of the world, whether it be in Eurasia or in Africa, has now become a feature of the war in Sudan, where drones are being flown into cities and destroying infrastructure in Port Sudan, the so-called capital of the RSF, this Hemeti, UAE-backed Hemeti, who's siphoning off much of the gold. His capital, Naila, has also been attacked by drones that have been provided by Erdogan's son-in-law, Bayraktar's company. So the same kind of weaponry that it's being marketed as a new kind of warfare in Gaza or in the eastern Ukraine is now being used to great effect, great destructive effect in places like Sudan. So that's where we're at.
Yeah. Well, look, I was just going to comment on how hard it is for people to understand all the names that are being given out here. I mean, I grew up, Isa, in Northern Ireland, and even that relatively simple conflict was very difficult for people that are outside the country to really get to grips with. So I'm also struggling somewhat with all the players now. What I'd like to get an idea of, because the British government insists that no British arms or weaponry goes to Sudan, that's banned. The question is, are British or European or United States, or how much weaponry from our military industrial complex is going through these Middle Eastern countries to contribute to that side of the conflict?
Again, I think there's many layers of separation now. I think that what the UK and US are doing are providing the kind of infrastructure of diplomacy, of maintaining and securing the narrative about what's going on in Sudan, as opposed to the actual mechanics of the war itself. The technical side and the ones who are actually fighting these wars are from the region itself or from Turkey, UAE, Russia. So those populations who have been scattered by events after the Cold War ended have found new niches, new roles to play, with manpower coming from countries that have historically trained their civilians in some shape or form in military. UAE doesn't really have a functioning army per se, but it does have the means to actually recruit actively from overseas. We know that RSF, for instance, Hemeti sent thousands of his fighters several years ago to Yemen, for instance. They also helped shore up the government in East Libya on behalf of the UAE and their allies in that war that happened since the fall of Gaddafi. So the manpower is provided to a large extent from Chad, Sudan itself, from Colombia, from other countries that seem to have become, as a kind of development model, availing their men to fight in wars around the world. Then, unfortunately, it includes Russians and Ukrainians. They're part of this story. The technicians who are perhaps flying the drones are actually coming from the UAE and from Turkey. The last series of air battles taking place with drones saw the death of technicians who were Turkish and Emirati, members of Emirati and Turkish military services. So that makes it an interesting way of answering your question. It's not arms coming from Lockheed Martin or their equivalent, BASF. These are not, those are too expensive, I think, for this kind of war. This is a war of machine guns, of some grenades, rocket-propelled grenades, and relatively cheap drones that are made in Turkey. Maybe there are some now factories in the Gulf. We don't know. Made in China, and they make their way into these theaters just like the old AK-47 used to do that. But the CIA, MI6, their allies in the region are more than happy to pay for those weapons. But the ones who are going to be dying are the ones who are hired as guns for hire, or not even guns for hire, but just to survive, to eat. We saw that throughout the wars in the 1990s in West Africa, that kids would be armed and they would be more than willing to kill because that's the only way they could eat, because they were orphaned. And Sudanese has produced, the wars, the violence in East Africa and the Horn of Africa has produced millions of such kinds of people who have no other means but to kill in order to, or avail themselves to kill in order for them to survive. That's their now. It's a very rational. Unfortunately, it's a very rational decision that people are making, who have, again, no families anymore, or they have families and they have to feed. So how are you going to do that when your country is in complete turned upside down? So you don't need boots on the ground. There may be, again, there are certain CIA and MI6 assets are on the ground observing all of this, as well as.
Are they just observing, or are they?
Well, maybe they are. They're also helping, facilitating and directing the way the conflict is being fought. But I think that, again, they've been able to separate themselves a little bit by way of having these other regional actors take the lion's share of the responsibility, from media and academic focus to the actual practical dying in these fields. So Turkish technicians, Emirati technicians are the ones now being killed alongside those that they are supporting, these local, regional fighters. So, but the responsibility still lies in Washington, in London, for sure. But that's how these wars, unfortunately, are so successfully. Blair and those types separate themselves so neatly, right? The war in Gaza is a war of empire, but we are going to focus on personalities like Netanyahu as almost exclusively responsible, or Hamas. Where in fact, this, as we can see with Trump's marketing, the future development of a destroyed refugee compound. I mean, this, if you really push it, this is the kind of nature of disaster capitalism. I don't like to use this woman's phrase, but this is very much the working model since the end of the Cold War. And unfortunately, Sudan has been sucked into this logic. And even though the Sudanese, by the vast majority, had a response to this, but they were never allowed to pursue democratically their demands for autonomy, for independence.
And just so that we're absolutely clear about this, I mean, you've talked about Russia and China's contribution to this, but is it the case that, in fact, the Belt and Road Initiative hasn't contributed to solving this problem in any way up to this point, or is it the case that actually that is the potential way out of this at the end of the day?
Well, the pipelines that, for instance, Kenya, which funded by Chinese finance, that will eventually spirit South Sudan's oil, not through Sudan, but through Kenya. That one could look at it in a positive way, but it's also kind of functioning in very much the same ways that I was just in very great detail explaining what was happening to these countries.
Yes.
I mean, building infrastructure to access DRC's minerals, whether it be done by way of Chinese financing and Chinese expertise, or development agencies that were in the back pocket historically with the United States or Britain, results in the same thing, the plunder of these countries with very little positive coming to nothing positive for the populations who are suffering from the environmental destruction, from often the lion's share of the wealth just being exported out to international markets. So in the end, the end result is the same. There are these new demands on raw materials that find their way out in international markets, regardless if it's done through a beltway that's funded by Chinese working class savings or by Wall Street. And there are people who are going to die on either end of that. There's nothing has been resolved with DRC. No one's intervened to stop the war in Yemen or in Sudan or in Ethiopia, even though supposed BRICS countries are invested in at least as a way it's marketed as an alternative to what has been long recognized as a fundamental problem with Western capital trying to secure the very same assets that are now availed because the heavy lifting has been taken over by the savings of Chinese middle class, who have been built up since the 1980s, 1990s, thanks to Europe's and America's infrastructure moving to China. So all of our Apple phones and all this technology that we're using to talk to each other now, which is now made by brilliant, hardworking people, and it has resulted in a huge pool of money that does the work of empire it's just in different terms. And sadly, weapons from China are killing people from Sudan, just like weapons from Israel or Turkey or BASF. And no one's put a stop to that.
And so, what do you think it's going to take to get a stop to? I mean, is this a matter of general populations understanding even that this is happening and being willing to provide some kind of opposition, or how do you see this ending?
Well, vast majority of Sudanese understood this from the very beginning, and again, their efforts to organize and peacefully, or maybe not even peacefully, but to secure independence from this juggernaut of globalization was suppressed by the very violent factions who are now at war with each other. How this is going to stop? It's not going to stop because the Donald Trump's administration or Tony Blair's think tank comes and saves the day. That's not going to happen because they're not interested in seeing the end of this war or any other war. What's going to stop it, unfortunately, is going to be the exhaustion of the people themselves, or that one of the factions actually is able to secure, ultimately, a military victory. But the very fact that if you, again, supposed rivals in the region, Turkey and Qatar versus Saudi Arabia and UAE, the very fact that all these countries have American military bases means that they all help supply Israel during their very particular war against indigenous peoples to secure resources, to change the dynamics of Palestine. They're all serving in the end a larger enterprise that has, unfortunately, since the Cold War, become quite very clear that it's a race to the end in which a very small percentage of the people in the world have absolute authority over our lives through their technology, through their laws, and more importantly, have absolute control over the natural resources and the wealth that these resources produce for them. And again, wealth equals power. They have more money than they can ever need, but the way that this wealth is accumulated actually destroys societies who have, until today, been able to at least put some kind of brake on this process that we've been monitoring for the last 200, 250 years. So societies like Yemen, like Sudan, in parts of Eastern Africa, Horn of Africa, who have incredibly sophisticated understanding of how their place in the world, and they've been articulating resistance to this. They have been destroyed by these various tactics. And unfortunately, that implicates everyone who benefits from the plunder of Africa, not just the usual suspects that we like to highlight in our own neighborhood. But this is a global phenomenon, and everyone who's seeing gold or oil, buying that oil and gold or the cobalt, they're all responsible for this, not unfortunately. And who's going to take the blame? UAE, Turkey, that's Israel. Those are, again, I think, a misdirection of our focus of critique. And we ultimately need to stop our own City of London, Wall Street, Shanghai people who are profiting from this.
I think that's a good place to leave it for today. Isa Blumi, thank you very much for joining me today. I would really love to follow up with this and look at other areas in Sahel and that are experiencing perhaps not to the same scale, but certainly insurgencies of their own, and understand this region a lot better, because obviously all the focus is on Eastern Europe and the Middle East at the moment, but it's not the only problem. So thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you very much.